1941 voyage into Baffin Bay on the Effie M. Morrissey in the basement of the San Rafael Library in 2017. He just had to have his own photocopy of the pages and then saved it as a PDF to share with academic polar archives. And since it was hard to read and many of the references so obscure, he had to transcribe the whole thing. And during the course of that, he discovered Captain Bob Bartlett's handwritten account of the same voyage and the troubled relationship between the two, sequestered on board with each other for 3.5 months. Bartlett's account needed transcription as well. Thus was born the current project, a side-by-side, day-by-day comparison of the two in a single volume. Years in the making, even though published, one day to be enlarged into a history of that voyage. David has also had the opportunity to document and publish an article in the, and I'm not going to say this right, the Marlin Spike magazine on a 4-year restoration of the Effie M. Morrissey in Booth Bay Harbor Shipyard in Maine, soon to continue her 126 history afloat. David Hirzel writes from Sky Ranch in Pacifica. When not writing, he might be found sailing in the bay or crossing the Atlantic, sharing his maritime expertise with fellow travelers. I think we're going to find this really interesting, just a different story of Louise Boyd. So I'm going to turn this over to David. Thank you, David. It's yours.
You're welcome, and hi, everybody. Nice to see you all turn out here. I'm going to go ahead and get right into my screen share and the PowerPoint, and we'll kind of get into this. Like this. Hold on one second. And we do the slideshow from the beginning. All right, the Socialite and the Sea Captain. So, hold on one second. I'm going to get this thing out of my face here. The Socialite and the Sea Captain. So Louise Boyd is, of course, who we call the Socialite. And we here in 21st century, we don't necessarily think of Socialite as a particularly ennobling sort of a word, but in Louise Boyd's era and in her own self-image, yes, it fits there. And the Sea Captain is Captain Bob Bartlett. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is they went to sea on an Arctic voyage at the behest of the United States government. And during the course of that, which started off a very friendly and rosy sort of relationship and friendship, kind of turned during the course of that. And we're going to go through that. And this is the cover of the book that I just have published, Socialite and the Sea Captain. So on your left, you see, of course, Louise Arner Boyd, our heroine of the day and of San Rafael. And an equally heroic individual, Captain Bob Bartlett, on the right-hand side. So this is the cover. And in the background, you can see a part of the map that once hung on the wall in Maple Lawn when Louise Boyd was still alive and living there, and like to refer to it. So my interest in these things is lifelong, and I mean going back to the very first things I read in my life, probably around the age of 8 or 10. And I just sort of always loved to read about people suffering from cold. And that stuck with me my whole life. And so I've done a lot of different research and a lot of writing. But this particular book, as Marcy just said, it's like, wow, I love these firsthand accounts. And wow, oh, we have our own Arctic explorer right here in San Rafael. And oh my goodness, at the time, some of her papers were stored in the basement of the San Rafael Library. I got wind of that, went down, and I photocopied her entire handwritten log, saying, okay, this is a great thing to have. And when you go to read this log, which I have available in a PDF that I can share with you if you're interested, but when you go to read this log, you realize that among other things, she had unique spelling. She had a unique loopy handwriting that was quite often hard to decipher. And so in order to even understand what it is she was talking about, I needed to put it into sort of regular doc format so I could read it, because I really wanted to know what happened. And as I read it, I realized the nature of this relationship between them. And it happens I'm very lucky to be able to go to Maine every summer. And in Maine, in the city of Brunswick, there is the Bowdoin Peary Arctic Archive, and they have Bob Bartlett's log of this same voyage, the entire log. So now my project of transcribing has suddenly doubled, because now I have a chance to see what two people had to say about each other the same day and the same time. Here we have Louise Boyd, and those of you who've been to Maple Lawn, which I think is many of you, I believe this is in downstairs in what we think of as the living room where the bar is. This map used to hang on the wall there. And this is the map of her voyages. And I'm not going to talk about any of her previous voyages in the Greenland Sea or the east coast of Greenland. That's an entirely different part of her polar explorations. That is this part of the map over here. But this, what we're talking about today, is this voyage, the only one like it that she made through Baffin Bay on board the Effie M. Morrissey. And just so, if you're not real familiar with Arctic polar exploration, this is Louise's map of her exploration. This is Bob Bartlett's map of his exploration, much in the same area, not so much in East Greenland, but up and down Baffin Bay. The important thing to remember about Bob Bartlett is he was in Baffin Bay, he was in this part of the Arctic, and he was actually with Admiral Peary when Peary made his final pitch to get to the South Pole, to the North Pole. And Bob Bartlett was actually in the last party that was turned back. So that party went up through here and up, and Bob Bartlett probably turned back about this close to the North Pole. So he is in his own right very much an Arctic explorer. And we'll talk about his adventures a little bit later on, which continued after that. But as you can see, he and his ship, the Effie M. Morrissey, did a lot of work up here in Baffin Bay. This is Captain Bob. This is Louise Boyd. And many of the pictures that we're going to see tonight, not very many of them come from this voyage. Almost everything comes from prior voyages that either of them had taken, but not with each other. And Louise Boyd, as we know, is a photographer, and she's actually a very well-known and experienced photographer, but I am not aware of any archive of photographs of the many hundreds that she took on this particular voyage. I have access to none that I know of. So bear in mind, I'm not really an academic, and I really am, the entire project of mine is not to document the whole voyage. It's only to create a transcription so we can see how these two felt about each other. Here is a larger view of that same map. It's actually the interior front cover of one of his several books. So the voyage that we're going to go with on today goes from Washington, D.C. up Brigus, that Newfoundland right there. That's where Bob is from. And our voyage is going to go up into here. But you'll notice that Bob Bartlett and the Effie M. Morrissey did go through the Panama Canal, did go through the Bering Strait, and did explore the Arctic Ocean over here. And also later on, or actually not later on, but evidently after this book, he was on board, he was captain of another Arctic exploration ship, the Karluk. And the Karluk was wrecked over here, shipwrecked here, and Bob Bartlett is really quite a heroic person. I'm not going to talk about the Karluk, but believe me, it is a fascinating story. So these people were both explorers. They were both pretty heady explorers, each in their own right. And each of them sort of was fairly headstrong in their self-image. Louise Boyd, in all of her, on the map previously, we just looked at her east coast of Greenland, all those expeditions that she brought from Norway to explore part of the coast of East Greenland. And there's actually an arid region over there on that island called Boyd Land, named after her for her events and some things that she discovered. She used two Norwegian ships that she chartered, the Hobby and the Vesla. And for those that are real polar enthusiasts, the Hobby had also been used by Amundsen at some point. Louise Boyd, the photographer. You'll notice the camera that she has there is pretty large. That's an Aero camera, A-E-R-O. And in her log that we're going to be having a look at, quite frequently she refers to different cameras that she has, the view camera, the speed graphic, and the Aero. The Aero was actually developed for aerial reconnaissance, And so has extremely powerful, precise lenses. And she used it for everything that she did, not just for snapshots, but for photogrammetry, which is a way of using photographs of regions to basically survey mountain areas. She was used to doing all this stuff, had been on, I think, 6 or 7 voyages, expeditions of her own. And when she was doing that, this is the crew on board the vessel Carey in 1938. And you'll see there's Louise, and she's actually palling around with her friends on board the vessel Carey. So it's important to remember that with these Norwegian crews and captains and ships, she got along quite well with the crews. And when we get to the North American crews of the Effie M. Morrissey, the captain, we're going to find out she didn't get along so well. One of the interesting things we're trying to research and get an understanding on. Bob Bartlett, he was an explorer on his own. The Effie M. Morrissey was his ship, and she spent many years, decades, going up and down through polar regions in the ice. She was built for the ice, and he was the man for the ship and the man to go into the ice and to do these things. On the left, you're going to see a picture of Bob Bartlett and the famous Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen. And this picture is probably from the mid-20s. So Knud Rasmussen, this is a whole nother really fascinating story, is really one of the best known and most important explorers and ethnologists for the Inuit people, studies of Inuit people all across the North American Arctic, from Alaska all the way over to Greenland. All of this changed. The nature of Greenland changed in 1939. Keep in mind, Greenland was a protectorate of Denmark. Denmark fell to the Germans in 1940. The Nazi-German threat was, and essentially the goal of Hitler and the Nazi Party was to dominate all of Europe and to take over, and they did dominate much of Europe for quite a few years, as we know. I don't want to get into the history of that, but the important thing to know about why this expedition of the Effie M. Morrissey was commissioned by the United States government had everything to do with the defense of the Allies in World War II. So just real briefly, we're familiar with geography, but Germany's here. And in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And in 1940, they took over France and much of Europe and Norway. Norway was actually Louise Boyd's, really her kind of favorite hangout for her expeditions. They all departed from Norway. And of course, the Nazis wanted to take over England, and England depended on shipping to survive, being an island. And so if they take a quick look at this map and say, this is controlled by Germany, Denmark is controlled by Germany. When Denmark was overrun, Greenland was controlled by Germany to the extent that it could be controlled by anyone. And so the United States at that time really moved into Iceland very quickly, because without Iceland, Germany could potentially dominate all the trade in North Atlantic. If Greenland became a German base, Greenland is next to Labrador. Labrador is next to this part of the United States. So it was very important to stop this. All right, so where does Louise Boyd come in? Louise Boyd was a well-known explorer. And so it would be nothing. The United States government approached Louise and said, we would like for you to go up into this area of the world, red herring. I mean, Louise Boyd could charter a ship and go exploring, and nobody would really notice. And Bob Bartlett could take his ship up into Baffin Bay, and nobody would really notice. And it was about understanding how radio transmissions functioned is one thing. Understanding of the North Magnetic Poles is another thing. Looking for potential airfields for Allied air bases. All of this to forestall German control of the North Atlantic. And why Louise Boyd, as I said, no one would be surprised that she went up there. So, where am I here? The United States government approached Louise and offered her and said, we would like for you to go up into the Baffin Bay and we would like you to do this. And here's why. When you need to charter a ship, and she approached Bob Bartlett, and Bob Bartlett, they arranged a deal where she would charter the ship and they would go. Now, always bear in mind as I'm talking about this, that both of them each considered himself to be a leader or the leader. This is conflict in the making. I'm going to read a little bit from Louise Boyd's letter, opening letter to Bob Bartlett in November 1st, 1940. And she's inviting him and saying, we would like to do this. Can you do this? And she said, this is a little bit of insight into her. Possibly it surprised you, she wrote, but we Arctic people are apt to head north at any time, are we not? So you notice this kind of collegial feeling that she has, that she understands is going to be reciprocated. And at first it was. She says, well, I have not gone into any details other than the Ionic. I'm not going to read that right there. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read a little piece here from Miss Kafarowski's book about Louise Boyd, because it's quite succinct. The principal purpose of the expedition was to secure data on radio transmission in the Arctic regions. There's urgent need of such data because evidence has accumulated, conditions differ radically from those elsewhere, and exact knowledge would yield the means of increasing the efficiency of radio communications across the Arctic regions, particularly to Europe and the Orient. So we needed to understand, this is 1939, 1940, we need to understand how radio waves are going to work because we need to do this communication. And we want you, Louise Boyd, to take our radio crew up there and measure this stuff, measure the radio wave. So I can't get real technical here because I'm not a radio guy. Here's our two explorers again. There's Bob, and he's captain of his ship. He's on the stern on the deck of the Effie M Morrissey. This is Louise Boyd. Both these pictures are not from this particular voyage, but she is on board one of her ships, one of her Norwegian ships that she used to charter. And you'll notice she's not exactly dressed high society. She's dressed for the weather. So Bob Bartlett. So one of the things we have to look at is the social milieu that these people came from. And he was just like a rough and tumble sailor from Newfoundland, and that's who he was and how he was. He was a self-made man, not a wealthy man, but everything about him was Bob Bartlett and what he wanted to do. And he was, you'll notice in this picture here, he's surrounded by a bunch of men, by a bunch of boys, because he's really interested in one thing, among other things, in developing young men into, adults. This goes into a little bit what we think of as sail training today, which is another one of my interests. I'm not going to get into too much, or not going to get into here at all, but just think of Bob Bartlett as a man's man, a man among men, the natural leader. And look at Louise Boyd, a woman among men, and in her own right, a natural leader. And keeping this in mind, because it's important, all the voyages that she took on the Vesla and the Hobby, they were all very collegial. They were all she was the leader. No one denied that she was the leader. She directed what would happen and when and why. And the captain would take the ship where she would want to go. But she got along well with the captains and the crews of the Norwegian ships. So this is the letter that started it all. And I just read a part of that letter. So I think we're good for that right there. So this is the Effie again in dry dock, and this is in Brigus, this is in Newfoundland. So we have a few photographs of this right here. And this is where the ship was always kept up to par. Wooden ships, they suffer a lot from being in the water. Wood is not really intended. Wooden ships don't really last, certainly not as long as the Effie has lasted. But if you want them to last, if it's your ship, and it was his ship, it was his girl, it was, as he occasionally called the Fem Morrissey, his boatie. So there's like a very much a anthropomorphism. Can't use that word right. But anyway, she's the very much the personification to him. And he took very, very good care of his ship. So I'm going to read just a little bit here, because this is important. So we're getting ready. The voyage left from Washington, D.C., and the idea was to go all the way up through Baffin Bay, as far north as they could get up in the Cane Basin, the very tippy end of Baffin Bay, almost to the Arctic Ocean. And lost my place here. Where's number 14? Bear with me for a second, because this is important. Oh, actually, here it is. So this is what I'm going to read to you is written right before the ship left Washington, D.C. So Louise Boyd had come out and was on the ship and had all her gear on board, and the crew was on board. And they were just prior to departure. And she'd been around on the ship for a week, so she knew enough about the people on board and what they were like and how it all worked. The crew are grand, she says. The crew are grand, and so is Mr. Will, Bobby's brother. I'm mentioning this to you now because this is before she gets to know them and before they get to know her. But here's a little thing that got her attention. This is very early on, same letter. She writes back, as I'm sure many of you know, her secretary, Miss Goethe, is back here in Maple Lawn. She corresponds back and forth. And so when you read letters she wrote to Miss Goethe, you're going to see a little bit of insight into Louise Boyd because they're more personal. Same letter, but she's talking about anchoring. And she says, last night he anchored, sat the Morissey right in the oyster nets and cussed them loudly this AM. I don't think there remains any cuss words for me to learn. I think the full vocabulary has been recited on this trip. So salty language from a sailor to, or in the presence of, a dame, a San Francisco dame, as she was occasionally referred to at the time. So each of these two people wrote in a diary and they recorded every day what went on. Now on the left, these 2 pages are from the same day. And Louise Boyd, you see how large her handwriting is, and you can see it's pretty big and pretty loopy. And this is actually one of the more readable pages. There are others that really take some studying to get into. Now on the right, you will see Bob Bartlett's personal log of the voyage. This is not the ship's log, which has very kind of scanty data about position and weather. And this is his diary. And when you read these 2 diaries, you get this sense of what these people are like, what they confide to the pages, in the privacy of their own thought in their own cabin. And Bartlett is pretty much of a poet. There's parts of him that are a poet. Wow, that guy has lovely writing. And Louise Boyd is looking and taking notes on all sorts of biology, and botany, and animals, and the people that she meets, and her impressions about the ship and the crew. So if you sit down to read either of these 2 books, well, you've got a challenge. You just have a challenge. And if you read something you think might be interesting, well, consider that Miss Boyd's is something like 250 pages long. It's kind of difficult to stay with it. I wanted to be able to read these for myself. So I did this. What this is one of the pages out of the book, The Socialite and the Sea Captain. This is actually the first page where they overlap. And just so you know, there were, before this volume 3 of Miss Boyd's take on this voyage, there's volume 1 and volume 2, which I'm unaware where they might be or if they still exist. This is volume 3. So volume 3 starts August the 18th and it goes up to about September 11th. And then there's a volume 4, which is also lost. So what we have is about a 6-week period in which the relationships between the crews have fairly well been developed. They are what they are, and not particularly good between Louise Boyd and her gang and Captain Bob and his crew. So the book, the transcription, is only concerned with this parallel of these two accounts. There's lots more to be said about the voyage. There's lots more information, but this is only about this. So that's what it looks like. Let me find my, hold on a second here. Got to keep track with this all right here. As you can see, well, among others, I'm going to go back here for a second. We'll take a quick look at this again. So each of these people had their own way of spelling, their own way of noting things, their own way of abbreviating things and marking time and everything else. And in transcribing, what I had to do was I had to take this and all these kind of stops and starts and things and illegibilities and so on and put them into something comprehensible that I could refer to. So I did not editing of content so much as editing of making paragraphs, sometimes making sentences and so on, to make it readable enough that doesn't drive you nuts. That's what it looks like. So we are here. So this is the boat, the ship, about to depart Brigus. And again, this is not necessarily from this particular voyage. Brigus, of course, is Captain Bob's hometown in Newfoundland, very northern peninsula of Newfoundland, or not, it's on the southern part of Newfoundland. But so that's who he was. He was a kind of rough and tumble country boy, for one thing. And he always stopped to see his mom and his family and went north and came back. So stopping here was in his element. By the time, I don't know exactly when this happened, but somewhere by the time we really get into our narrative in a few weeks here, you can see that a great deal of disrespect has grown for Bob Bartlett. That Bob Bartlett had towards Louise Boyd. And so we start seeing her being referred to in his diary pretty consistently, almost exclusively as Maggie, or occasionally Lady Godiva. Not, I don't think because she went around nude, but just because it was a detrimental way for him to look at her. And Bob Bartlett went from Bobby at the beginning of the voyage to, by the time we check into this, she just calls him CB, the initial CB. That's all she refers to him as, that CB for Captain Bob. Take a quick look at this map again. So this is the map that I use in the book here, and it departed from Washington, D.C., which of course is like way down here on the map. It came around and stopped at Brigus, and went to the northern tip of Newfoundland, and then went across the Davis Strait to Cape Farewell. And all of this, the only part of the voyage that we are concerned with, because it's the part we have the diaries for, is here from Etah down here to the ship at sea. So most of this we don't have to date the records, the detailed records, the diaries or anything like that. Actually, we have Bob Bartlett's total diary for the entire voyage, but my work of transcribing, and it wasn't pretty labor intensive work to get all this, was only what do we have that we can share the days that he had on board with Louise Boyd's diary. So what we're going to do, so all of this happened, and these problematic relationships were developing all through this entire voyage here until we got to Etah. And Etah was at the time, and probably still is, the northernmost permanent habitation of human beings anywhere on Earth. It's very far north and very cold and very primitive. And only a few decades before they stopped at Etah, the people of Etah were Inuit people that lived in snow houses and lived by hunting, very, very precarious life. And so we're kind of stopping in here at Etah. And this is where the United States developed an air base up there. You may have heard of Thule Air Base. Well, they moved a U.S. Air Force Air Base right up there into Etah. And it's not part of this discussion today, but just think in terms of you have primitive people who have lived this way for hundreds of years and very non-literate, very close, very deeply involved in the surrounding environment. And all of a sudden, bam, you come in and they level everything and they start flying planes in and out. Think about what that does to a person's sense of community. This is what Etah looks like, or it's like part of what Etah looks like, the Fiuke Ford, in the way it looked in 1938. So the sea is frozen over. The fjord is frozen over. It's like frozen solid. You can dog sled over. And in the back of this photograph here, you can see the glacier coming down. This is where we are. And think of this. Bob Bartlett and Louise Boyd are in their element when they're here. Let's see here. So I'm going to go to... So the very, very opening pages of Louise Boyd's diary, volume number 3, is on August 18th. And these are, so this is, essentially this is the start of the book. Louise Boyd writes, "Weather superb, clear sun, no clouds, no wind. Volume 3 of this year's diary log of my 1941 Arctic expedition starts on a day I long will remember. One I will keep clearly in mind as long as fate allows me the capacity of that brain encyclopedia of my life's many interesting events by which to turn over and peruse into its various pages and chapters. In 7 Arctic voyages, this has been my first where I have seen walrus more than one at a time." So this is Louise Boyd looking out on this view and writing this. And Bob Bartlett waxes poetic, and he does quite frequently. That's one of the true little wonders of this book, or of this log here. This is Bob Bartlett. "Hours and hours, I stand and gaze at the marvelous colors along the sides of the fjord. So much wet and fog and rain has let the grass and the moss gleam. The fungi that covers the ledges and the bird cliffs for dry henna color, the wet with the changing light make a very wonderful scenic effect. Any designer watching the light effects would get a design for a dress, for carpets, for rugs. If he were a painter, he would be in his element." So Bob why does he do all this? For one thing, because it touches him and it moves him. And this is where, when you get this transcription of a book like this, when you read someone's diary and read just what they wrote for their own use, you go, ah, I see something that I wouldn't otherwise have known about him. Well, it's not always rosy. In fact, the next day, when the ship was leaving Etah, ground. Ground. So this is on August 19th. And Louise Boyd, of course, had chosen Bob Bartlett for his great experience and the experience of his crew and his brother Will and all these people who had been up there and spent time in this where nobody has spent anywhere near as much time. But the ship ran aground. And he's CB. He's not Bobby anymore. CB says we're a mile off Cape Chalon, but I do not believe it. We were not a city block away. I just said to the mate, Mr. Will, we're close inshore, must be deep. Yes, ma'am, it's very deep off here all along, over 100 fathoms inshore here. No sooner were the words out of his mouth than they were followed with, my God, full speed astern. Oh my God, the rocks, the rocks. Yes, I see the rocks, and there they were, and aground we were. Clear weather, no fog, no wind, in waters that CB knew well. Some navigators. So there you get a little flavor of Miss Boyd when she was annoyed. And you can safely say that throughout much of this voyage, they were both highly annoyed with each other. Here we have, this is a still screenshot of a movie of the Effie M Morrissey in Arctic waters. So that's why it's so fuzzy and blurry, but it's just kind of interesting. Here's our ship. This is the ship, and think about this. There's about 25 people on board this ship, and it's not very large. And when you're here, you're not getting away from each other. And if you're not getting along, tense times continue. What can I say? Maggies Gang. Well, of course, she didn't call herself Maggie, and it's not entirely clear who did, but Bob Bartlett never called her anything else unless it was Lady Godiva. And so they were on this mission, and it's not clear to me at the moment exactly how much Bob Bartlett, how secretive this was on Louise Boyd's end of things. But these are her gang. So these are the people that were directly under her charge, and this is a surveyor and a radio guy, and they would go ashore every day, or as close to every day as possible. And so these four were together, and they were sort of cut off from the rest of the crew in a sense. So there was not this kind of enveloping camaraderie between all the crew members. There was Bob Bartlett, which included his brother Will, the mate, and his nephew, and friends and so on, and people he'd known for a long time. And he was a man among men. They were all very manly. And Maggie's gang, well, they didn't really have all that much respect, I don't think, for Maggie's gang. Oh, I've changed my outline here a little bit. Let's go to August 30th, though. So Louise Boyd is a photographer. And like I said, we don't have all that many photographs. These photographs are at the Marine History, at the Historical Museum. And I'm not sure how many there are. When I went through the archives, and I did this about 4 years ago, I took note and copies of the things that I thought were most useful. And what this is, we see here is some Eskimo, and throughout, of course, we're dealing in 1930. And the word Eskimo is lately, I mean, in current times, it's considered to be a not very respectful name for the Inuit people that live up there. But all the same, because they use the word Eskimo, I use the word Eskimo and hope that that will be all right. Let me just find here. This is 2030, 21st. So this is how she describes the women that you see in this photograph here. And notice on these outfits that they're wearing, that they're similar in color and size and shape and so on, but they're also each quite unique in the various kind of banding that's going on. One type of costume they wear, this is Louise Boyd, they wear is a sort of, oh, and she always used her spelling, Louise's spelling was unique. So where we would say a parka, you know, like a parka, a heavy coat with a hood that you would wear, she called a parker. And so that was one of her misspellings that I left in the transcription. One type of costume they wear, a sort of parker that goes over the heads, made of white cotton material, banded along the edges with colored tape well down the hips or thigh. In the back of the parker is a panel of the same white material and the same banding. Opening at the neck, one sees a blouse, usually of colored print material. In their tents, I notice Singer sewing machines, and that they use metal thimbles when sewing. 2 generations before, these women sewed with sinew peeled out of seal carcasses for thread to sew things together. No sewing machine, no Singer sewing machine. And this is one of the things that happens with the coming of progress. And for better or for worse, the old ways get left behind and get forgotten. In the background, you'll see the government station where the RCMP have their station there. On the hill close by, I'm reading again from the diary, took a speed graphic, that's the camera. On the hill close were 17 graves, small white headstones, each outlined with whitewashed stones. Eskimo writing on the headstones and in hieroglyphics. Took Eskimos by the headstones as a scale, and for them, took color Kodachrome of the interior of the Catholic Church. That was one of the buildings that we saw in the previous slide. So she's taken hundreds of photographs, and she takes lots and lots of notes on the photographs, or she refers to them in this diary here. But it's just so interesting that the photographs to any of this particular voyage, I'm not aware of. And this is why this book, this transcription, is really a lead into a much larger book that I may or may not have time to get into, which is like, well, where are those photographs? And what is going on? And what was learned? And where is it? Well, right now, we're talking about the transcription. So now I'm going to read a little bit here, and I'm just reading kind of interesting things here. So this is from September 22nd. And this is actually, they both of them are this is a reference the same day, September 22nd, toward the end of the voyage here. This is Bob Bartlett. Maggie was coming aboard at the same time, so after her supper, she came into the cabin and chinned all night, having sleeping spells between. She looked like hell. Boy, isn't she the limit? And then when they wanted to go to their ship as some visitors, she kept talking and talking. She doesn't seem to think much of anything but herself and her goddamn pictures. Jesus, she is so tiresome. At last I've had to say, well, so that's Bob. Here's Louise. And she's talking about the same being in the cabin talking with people. But next to me and next to the ionosphere sets, Reg, that was one of her crew, one of her gang. Reg and his table nearer are something to note. Unique, I shall say, for just awful does not seem now to express his method of conveying food from plate to mouth. Starts with elbows on the table, or off from the racks we have to use. From there, the forearm swings the food shovel-light from the plate to lowered mouth, posed ready to catch the slung-in food, the fork gripped by the whole hand on top. What falls on the oilcloth table cover is taken by the fingers and shoveled in the ready and waiting mouth. So as you can see, the opinions of these members of the crew have fallen pretty low for each other. I'm going to return here to Louise Boyd's map again, because this is the whole map. This is the course of the voyage. And so her diary, let's see, Captain Bob's diary starts here in Washington and stops in New York, into Brigus, and into the north part of Newfoundland, all the way around up into Etah, and then down the coast here. And right about here is where, as I said earlier, the voyage in question that I've just read a few passages from, and it's to me, it's really just fascinating to see what these people saw and thought about, not only each other, but their experiences and what went on. And I got, let's see if I can find this. So at the end of the voyage, what started out when I read a little piece from that initial letter, and she said, Captain Bob is grand, the crew are grand, we'll get along so well. This is towards the end, not the very end of the voyage. This is October 29th. It's from a letter that she wrote to one of the sponsors. I have lost all respect for Robert Bartlett and feel this is just another holdup in one of his tricks. He'll never over my dead body get that money I call his bonus for good behavior. Not a cent of it. So we've gone from just grand to not over my dead body. So the last thing I want to leave you with, so the upper part of this photo that we're looking at here, this is from the archives out at the Bowdoin Center in Brunswick, Maine. So every ship has what's called a ship's articles. And the ship's articles open up when the ship is getting ready, who signed on board. So here's the names of the people, everybody that signed on board. And here's Louise Boyd's name in this part of the log right here. And this is a historical record. It says who signed on, when they signed on, what their hometown is, what their pay is going to be, a few notes of various things. And then towards the end over here, when they sign off the voyage. But I want you to pay close attention. Here's Louise Boyd. Here's her line. And this is a legal document. And the question is, both of these people each thought that they were the leader. And neither one was really willing to share this notion of leadership. And that's at least partly at the heart of why all this happened. So she was a photographer, but you will notice here, here's the same line blown up a little bit, because I wanted to point out here, here's Louise Boyd, and the witness had signed her in and date, some information. And over here, you'll see some scribbles. This is the legal document. This is the record of the voyage. Somebody went in and crossed out leader and wrote in photographer. That would be Bob Bartlett that did that. So one thing that, that this transcription allows is anybody that's reading it with a, just to kind of see, it's just going to get some insights into humanity. But this is the most telling thing. I was so fascinated when I saw this, that leader, she signed on as leader. And he said, no, she wasn't the leader. She was the photographer. Well, I'm almost to the end of my talk here, but there's a lot of, there's plenty of information about these two explorers that can be had. And I want to point out right here, this book here by Derlin Anima is the first of the two biographies that I'm aware of. It was published right here in San Rafael, based on the Marin Historical Archives. And then this more recent book, The Polar Adventures of a Rich American Dame by Joanna Kafarowski. And both of these two books are different from each other, and they have different information and different ways of looking at things. And of course, in these biographies, our 1941 voyage is only just a small part of the long, long history of Louise Boyd. This is one of the books published of Louise's books, The Coast of Northeast Greenland, that is for the American Geographical Society. This is just a galley copy of my book right now. Bob Bartlett wrote a number of books, autobiographies. These two here were both published before this voyage of the Effie M. Morrissey, so they don't have anything about it, but they provide insight as to who this fellow is and how he sees himself. Phoenix of the Seas, a ship biography of our dear Effie M. Morrissey. And if you really want to read just a harrowing polar adventure, Bob Bartlett was captain of the Carluck. This is in 1915, through the Bering Strait. The ship was wrecked. The leader of that expedition, who was recognized as leader, Stephenson, left the ship embedded in the ice. The ship drifted across the Arctic Sea and eventually wrecked and was crushed over near Wrangel Island on the Siberian side. And Bob Bartlett in this expedition is really one of the true heroic figures that you can read about. The long distances, he kept most of those people alive. It's completely harrowing. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this kind of thing, to go there. And here is the Effie, a long, long ship. Through a unique combination of circumstances, the Effie has been afloat and functional, and is finishing up about a 4-year, really major overhaul, which I've been a part of. And this is in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine. And I'm going to close the talk right now, but I'm happy to entertain any questions, for one thing. And I have the photographs of the restoration of the Effie M. Morrissey, should anyone be interested to have a look. So for now, I would like to say thank you for your kind attention. I'm going to give up the screen share and turn it over to Marcy.
Thank you, David. Let's see if we have any questions here. I don't see any questions. I was wondering, something that I've understood was, and I don't know if this particular trip was financed with Louise's money through the American Geographic Society, but I know that caused a lot of problem between her and different scientists and leaders, that they resented a woman financing the trip, and that hurt their egos. And I just wondered if that affected their relationship here.
Well, this would be the government paid for all of this. All of her previous expeditions, she paid for out of her own fortune, which eventually she spent it all during the course of her life. This one in particular was paid for by the US government because they chartered the ship and they wanted this information really to support the war effort.
So Captain Bartlett knew it was US money, government money paying the way?
It's hard. There's a lot that a question like that, I can't really give like a real answer, because I don't know how much he knew, because it's somewhat, to me, when you read his words, it seems that possibly his disrespect for Maggie and Maggie's gang stems from the fact that he didn't really fully understand what they were up to, or why they were important, or why what she wanted. And really, like when she said, which she would say as the leader, like, we need to land over here. And that would be because her scientists that were with her as part of Maggie's gang would indicate this is where we need to go to get this information that we need. And it's not clear to me that Bob Bartlett necessarily understood all that, because it was, that part of it was kind of top secret. I mean, we really didn't want.
Right, I understand.
We were preparing to defend this area in any way.
We have records of her outfitting her trips. And I noticed in that part of her records that you showed there that she was upset about what food was being served and that he was controlling the food portions. We have the records of her buying the supplies from Abercrombie and Fitch. So possibly not for this particular trip.
Well, when there's like there's like a whole lot, there's a lot of information. And one day maybe I'll actually create like a real book about this trip. But right, for me, it was like, I want to understand what these people said. That's the extent of my limit right here. But I would like to mention, since you mentioned she was in charge of food, that Louise Boyd starts every day with what she had, or I guess this might be for the previous day, a listing of what she had for breakfast and what she had for lunch and what she had for supper. And it would be like one egg and a piece of toast, Jello, Welch's grape juice, which I'm sure Welch's possibly got a little bit of product placement there, I'm not sure. But it's sort of interesting that she was interested in the big things and the beautiful things, and particularly the botany, really, and pretty copious notes. And then on the other hand, what we would think is like eminently forgettable things, like, what did I have for breakfast yesterday? Do I care? Does anybody care?
Roger wants to know if you've been to the Arctic.
No, I haven't. And here's, I also write about Antarctica. And the farthest north I've been, I think I got into, I go to Maine every summer. That's really about, and I've been I've been to Norway, so that's pretty far north, and Iceland. And actually, I have to say this, last time I was out there, I did cross the Arctic Circle by maybe a mile, and the ship kind of like traveled long ways along the Arctic Circle, so we could all say, we got our blue nose thing there. But mostly the way I look at it is I read copiously about these firsthand accounts, these historical accounts. So I want to go there. I don't really want to go there now when you can just go there. I want to go there in, like Louise Boyle. I want to go there in 1941. I want to go there in 1915. I want to go there in 1898. And I do that, through reading.
David wants to know if, since this was wartime, in her notes, does any of her notes mention or reflect on the scarcity of food?
They had their, what she, I mean, they were stocked. The ship was supplied and stocked from Washington and so on. So they had no problems with that. There's probably 3/4 of this voyage is in diaries or records that are not addressed. So I can't really get to that. But she does from time to time refer to the Nazis and refers to trying to listen to Winston Churchill talking over the radio and how bad the radio reception was. And that was partly, a lot of what they were doing was like, how can we, using science, get the radio reception be good enough that we can actually communicate?
Let's see what else. Someone has asked, is there a report somewhere addressing the objectives you mentioned of the voyage that's top secret, or are there any reports of the government?
I'm sure there's a lot of government records. And one of the things that I would do if I was like, I'm still among the working people, so I have to like use my time that way. So I can't exactly take off and take a month and go to Washington, D.C. and go through the National Archives and the records and so on. So I'm sure there's like a ton of stuff there. And there is so much stuff that I'm sure is out there. And it's also, a lot of this stuff is now digitally available, if I wanted to really go search for it. But this would be like the whole next level. And I've already got probably a couple hundred hours into what I've got right here, just for this, because I wanted to be able to read it. And so it's not that I wouldn't want to put more time into it, but it's also like, I'm going to leave this transcription stand for a little while, and possibly sometime my ship will come in. Who knows? But, I may get there and I may do it. And this would be essentially the seedling from which a real story grows.
Well, thanks, David. Everyone thanks you for this really interesting talk. It was just a whole different side of the story. When will your book be available?
It's available right now.
Oh, good.
At Amazon and get it right now.
Okay. People wanted to know where they could find it.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon right now, and it'll be because I just put it out and I'm just kind of reading through it, and I'm going, there's every once in a while I say, well, there's a typo. That doesn't look good. So, but I just spent like, I don't know.
It was nice that you mentioned
the last
other
month going through trying to root out all the typos, and eventually I had to say, I'm done. Good. I wanted to read the thing. There it is. Like, don't stress over it.
It's nice that you mentioned the other books that were written on Louise. I can't recommend, Derlin and Nima has written 2 books on Louise. We have them at the library in our research, and they're also available on Amazon. But the Arctic Explorer book that she wrote it's the best one that I've seen written that isn't technical. So you get a good idea what was going on, and I really enjoyed that one. Just really want to thank you for everything tonight in this talk. I think everyone appreciated it. So thank you.
My pleasure. I love doing this stuff. I mean, I just love researching and finding and putting it together and making sense. Share it. So I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you're all-
Thank you.
You're all very welcome.
You did a great job. You did a great job.
Nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
Hi, Alice.
So,
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good morning, Marcy.
This is Joe.
Oh, yeah.
Good night, all.